There are foods that can stimulate glucagon-like peptide 1, GLP-1, which is the same thing that we are targeting with exogenous semaglutide or Ozempic. Okay, semaglutide is a GLP-1 receptor agonist. Okay, what that means in very simple terms is that when we consume food, we have cells in our gut that produce GLP-1. GLP-1 then allows us to feel satiated, but it also stimulates insulin production to bring our glucose levels down. Now, in the mainstream right now, we see a lot of people taking semaglutide because it can have this effect where it can control appetite, but it can also lower glucose and improve insulin function. That's great, but if you're not someone that really needs it, it could actually be detrimental. It's not something that everyone should just be going out and taking willy-nilly. So I've got foods that you can consume that have effects similar to semaglutide. Of course, not the same potency. That would be irresponsible to say. We're talking a pharmaceutical versus food, but still, we should start with the food because this is very impactful stuff. Before we jump right into the first one, it's important to know that the idea behind GLP-1 is not just to reduce your appetite. That is a complete misnomer. The idea behind GLP-1 receptor agonists is to help out beta cells within the pancreas. It helps create insulin more effectively. And most people think insulin is bad. Insulin is actually good when it's in the right amount. So what GLP-1 receptor agonists do is they take care of the pancreatic beta cells so that they are better at producing insulin more potently, more effectively at the right time in response to food, thereby helping out people that have blood glucose issues. Now let's jump into the foods. The first one we need to address is one that needs no introduction, but we do need to understand the science. That is going to be whole food protein sources. Protein shakes are great, don't get me wrong. I love them, I use them, but they will not spike that GLP-1 the same way that whole food protein will. Let's take a look at some research. There was a study published in Nutrition, Metabolism, and Cardiovascular Disease. It looked at a high protein diet versus a high carbohydrate diet for 6 months. What they found is that subjects that were on the high protein diet ended up having 100% remission of their pre-diabetes. Those that were on the high carb diet only had a 33% remission of their pre-diabetes, even though they lost roughly the same amount of weight and ate roughly the same amount of calories. Now, why did this happen? It's speculated that the high protein group had a much more significant secretion of GLP-1. This much more significant secretion of GLP-1 led to better insulin response and ultimately lower glucose. Even though both groups lost weight, that's where we can't say that like all food is created equal as long as calories are matched. They ate roughly the same amount of calories, they lost roughly the same amount of weight. One group went into pre-diabetes remission and one group pretty much didn't. Now the reason that like a protein shake doesn't have the same effect, even though it's protein, is the rate of digestion and the overall motility can play a big role too. So although a protein shake can satiate you, it doesn't have the same impact on GLP-1 that say a slower digesting protein would. I popped a link down below for ButcherBox if you want to get some grass-fed, grass-finished beef. There's obviously lots of places that you can get good quality beef these days, but the nice thing about ButcherBox is honestly, it's the best tasting grass-fed, grass-finished beef I've ever had. It gets delivered to your doorstep. You can completely customize your box. So whatever you want. You can do New Yorks, you can do fillets, you can do ribeyes. Now they have all kinds of different options. They have sustainable seafood options. They have chicken options. They have pork options. Their breakfast sausage is like the best breakfast sausage I've ever had. So at the end of the day, it comes down to taste. And it's what's gonna keep us coming back. And this stuff is amazing. So I popped a link down below. That way you can also check out my custom boxes, the type of cuts that I typically get personally, but you can also just kind of shop around and see what cuts you would like. So it's called ButcherBox. It's down below, first line of the description, directly underneath this video, and you can check them out. No obligation, but just worth a check after this video. This next one is interesting because it's unsaturated fats. And it's not to say that saturated fats are bad. It's just to say when we are trying to increase GLP-1 and have a similar effect as much as we can to something like semaglutide, we got to look at everything. So there was an interesting paper that compared butter to olive oil. It's really interesting. They took healthy participants and type 2 diabetic participants. They gave them 50 grams of carbohydrates with butter, and then later on gave them 50 grams of carbohydrates with olive oil. What they found is that the olive oil group had a potent secretion of GLP-1, much more potent than the butter group did, which is interesting because they're both fats. But what we have to look at is the type of fatty acid receptors. We have free fatty acid receptor 1 and free fatty acid receptor 2, which have a very, very strong affinity, or rather polyunsaturated fats and monounsaturated fats have a strong affinity to these receptors. They bind very strongly to these free fatty acid receptors, consequently triggering a very strong, very potent GLP-1 response. That's why fats can be so satiating, but the big problem we face with things like macadamia nuts, like almonds, like even olive oil, even some of these oils to begin with, very easy to overconsume them in a short amount of time. So although they can directly kill your appetite and they can improve insulin function and all this stuff, if you eat 5,000 calories of them in a sitting, it's going to be a problem, right? So that's what you have to do. You have to make sure you eat very slow when it comes down to these fats. And I promise you, if you like slowly munch on macadamia nuts, you will be very, very satiated from them. But if you allow yourself to just engulf an entire bag, then you're going to have a different situation. Now, what was interesting is that with this study, there were similar improvements in healthy people and type 2 diabetics. So it helped people across the board. So even if people were dealing with high glucose issues, when they had carbs alongside olive oil, it improved their postprandial glucose and ultimately their GLP-1. The next one is super, super interesting, and it's kind of a hack. Okay, something out there called allulose, and it's a non-nutritive sweetener. Like we see it in all kinds of different processed foods and like low carb products, but allulose can be used as sort of a tool. Now, this research, we look at rodent model research, but what we have to understand is that rodent model research paves the way for the future. Like we can look at that and say, hey, this is really interesting stuff. We also kind of layer it in with the epidemiological and the observational data that we have. There was a study published in Biochemical Biophysical Research Communications that gave rodents a 0.5 gram to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight allulose. What they found is that 2 hours after eating, when they gave them this allulose, they had a significant reduction in glucose and a potent secretion of GLP-1. So much so that the research even said this could literally be used as a way to prevent overeating. It was that potent of a GLP-1 response. The cool thing is, allulose was more effective than glucose, fructose, and dextrin. So even though it's technically considered a carbohydrate, even though it's technically very, very low calorie, almost 0 calorie, it had a bigger impact on GLP-1. So you could add this to your fruit, you could bake with it, you could make cookies and use allulose instead of sugar, and you could actually have an effect that has an appetite suppressant, insulin supporting effect. Really powerful stuff. Then we move into the next category that's pretty specific but very interesting. Specific flavonoids. Certain flavonoids that are in particularly Mediterranean style foods can bind to the free fatty acid receptors similarly to poly and monounsaturated fats. In this particular case, quercetin. Okay, quercetin you're going to find in like garlic, you're going to find it in onions, asparagus, and very, very potently in capers. So eating those kinds of foods might actually stimulate GLP-1 and make you have less of an appetite, or you could just straight up take quercetin supplements, which has a big impact too. Additionally, curcumin, okay, just adding in like turmeric, curcumin to your food has a big impact. And then EGCG, which you're gonna get in green tea or straight up green tea extract. This can also bind to the free fatty acid receptor, so super intriguing stuff. Okay, now we jump back to like a whole food thing here for a second, and there's some very interesting ones that I have still towards the end here. Fiber in and of itself is a very, very potent stimulator of GLP-1. Now, the reason that it does this is when fiber ferments and it turns into these short chain fatty acids, this seems to regulate GLP-1 function. So more fiber, the more diverse microbiome, the more short chain fatty acids, the more overall GLP-1 we can produce. So this isn't something where you say, hey, I'm gonna eat some fiber and it's gonna have a GLP-1 effect. This is more so, no, if I add fiber to my diet, it's going to make other foods more effective at stimulating GLP-1. Okay, here's this next one. Mixed nutrition, mixed nutrients. What do I mean by this? Okay, if you look on the surface, if we add protein to carbohydrates, it'll slow down the digestion of carbohydrates, thereby lowering glucose, right? Well, what if there was another piece of the equation? What if we were, from like a biological perspective, rewarded for getting adequate nutrition. If protein and carbohydrates are combined, we might actually stimulate more GLP-1 than just with carbs alone or just with protein alone. The same can be said for fats and carbohydrates. We're almost rewarded for getting a more diverse amount of food. So diversity of food and combinations of foods can actually stimulate more GLP-1. So if you were to say, hey, I'm gonna have, I don't know, some lean ground beef along with some macadamia nuts, along with a little bit of fiber, along with maybe a little bit of sweet potato, that might actually stimulate more GLP-1 than equal amounts of any of those foods independently. This is up and coming research, but it's very, very interesting that there's synergistic effects. So you might want to actually look at getting more diverse foods with each meal to literally satiate you more. And lastly, although we've already talked a little bit about the Mediterranean diet, when it comes down to a potent effect on GLP-1, Mediterranean takes the cake. But what are the attributes of it and how does it work? Well, there was a study published in Diabetes Metabolism Research and Reviews that took a look at a Mediterranean diet compared to a high fiber veggie diet. I found this very interesting because normally people think that a Mediterranean diet is so close to a plant-based diet that you're basically talking about plant-based. And people kind of get their guard up. Oh, don't go Mediterranean on me. I don't want you to start going plant-based on. This actually compared vegetarian along with, like in high fiber, next to Mediterranean. They gave subjects a Mediterranean meal, and then they gave them an isocaloric, higher carb, higher fiber vegetarian meal. They found the Mediterranean meal triggered a much more potent GLP-1 response, as well as an oxyntomodulin effect, which is the precursor to GLP-1 and GLP-1 receptors. What does this ultimately mean? What we have to look at is what a Mediterranean diet has in it. Higher protein compared to a veggie diet. You're gonna have foods rich in quercetin. You're gonna have foods that have some of those other components we've talked about. It's high fiber, high mono and polyunsaturated fats. So you've got all the whammies that you need together to make a very potent GLP-1 stimulating diet. So if you factor all these things in and you sprinkle them in throughout your diet, you're really looking at a pretty potent way to trigger GLP-1 without having to go to your doctor and get on something that everyone's like clawing for and clamoring for that may or may not be safe down the road. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. See you tomorrow.